Sawasdee ka. Welcome everyone for this very special time, evening, morning, whenever you are coming from. This is a part of our speaker series organized by the Amar Mundi Lab or the Amar Mundi World Making Lab. And this is part of our speaker series called Multispecies World Making Possibilities in the More Than Human Anthropocene. So it will run this year and continue to next year for this time. And just briefly to introduce about our lab is curated by Maya Kovskaya, who will be joining us today in the roundtable discussion. And we also have a range of scholars, artists, students who are interested in Anthropocene from social science, humanities, arts, science, to find ways to collaborate and do work together in this world-making practices and finding possibilities and overcoming challenges to unfold this unfolding violence of Anthropocene or other themes that you may have heard. And this is a part of our wish or our aim so that we can find ways to better co-inhabit our shared world with more than humans in this very entangled world. We are multidisciplinary and we also focus on research, also art practices in order to find ways to offer critical space to reimagine what it means to be human in this more than human ecological world. And our more Mundi multi-species ecological world-making lab started this year, and this speaker series is one of our ways to find friends, find collaborators, and also find other ways and possibilities to be part of this more than human Anthropocenes. And I would like to do a quick land acknowledgement. Even though we are coming from various parts of the world and also here in Thailand and Chiang Mai, we may not have the same histories as other places who have different history with colonizations. But we would like to acknowledge that this land that we speak, work, and live belongs to all earthly beings, past, present, and future, including many diverse indigenous peoples who came here and made homes long before there were nations or states. And we would like to emphasize that we need to actively begin to decolonize these relationships with the natural world, returning stolen lands to traditional custodians who have proven their capabilities and will to preserve the biodiversity and landscape integrity in the lands under their stewardship. This is a needed first step because we believe that decolonization is not a metaphor. And to begin today's talk, we are very, very fortunate to have Terike Haapoja to be joining us today from Finland at the moment. And she is a visual artist, but based on New York. And her work has been working on various installation work, publications, writings, and political projects to investigate the mechanics of othering with a specific focus on issues arising from the anthropocentric worldview of Eurocentric traditions. Her work has been featured and also given many, many prizes, including the Dukaatti-prize for live arts, and including the Ars Fennica prize nomination. There's Haapoja or Terike also collaborate with Laura Gustafsson, and who is a writer and has been awarded with Finnish State Media Art Award in 2016. She is also an adjunct professor at Parsons Fine Arts and NYU in New York. And currently she's working on art and research project on animal capitalism that approaches with exploitation of the human and non-human animal body as foundational to capitalism. So I will would like to invite Terike to join us today and briefly say hi to everyone before we begin the talk.
Thank you so much, Aria, and everybody. Very nice to be here. Where in different locations we are. I'm talking from Finland, where I'm originally from, though I'm now based in New York. And so just very looking forward to talking about all these things with you. The talk is actually something I wrote already just right before the pandemic in 2020. So it doesn't really address the questions that have emerged since then. It's more like an overview of my thinking in relationship to the question of our relationship to the modern human from the perspective of vulnerability and our relationship to mortality, but also touching on issues that have to do with animalization, dehumanization, and the sort of our relationship to ethically live amongst ourselves. And usually when people ask what's my, like, what is the red thread in my thinking, I think the question is something as simple as like how to be here with others, how to live here with others. How do we do that in practice? How do we establish relations that are somehow not violent? Aria mentioned a little bit about the new work that I've been building during these 2 years of the pandemic. That's still in the starting phases, so that's why I wasn't prepared to talk about it now, but I'd be happy to share materials or the upcoming work and research on that. And Animal Capitalism is an umbrella for a larger research and arts project where I'm trying to think of the use of animal body and its ability to labor and biologically reproduce and produce matter as foundational to capitalism, and through that center animal agriculture in our thinking of environmental justice, but also center the exploitation of the animal body in the sense of factory farming and industrial animal agriculture to the center of our thinking of our post-human, thinking of relationships. So I won't go into that in this talk, but I'd be happy to share thoughts about that later. And the talk is 45 minutes, and then happy to discuss it more. And also a lot of the work is, or some of the work is online on Vimeo, so I'd be happy to share the text or links to the works if someone's interested. Yeah, that's it. The second law of thermodynamics describes the increase of entropy in the universe. This process is irreversible, and so entropy also acts as an arrow of time. Perhaps then loss is how we experience entropy. But even though I'm starting my talk with loss, it's good to also remember that what precedes the grief of losing something is attachment, the love, care, and attention forming the basis of coexistence and communality. The figure of the animal entered my work indirectly. This early one-channel video installation wasn't a conscious exploration into questions regarding animality or ecology, but rather an attempt to grasp something that deeply concerned my own lived reality. 2 years earlier, I had witnessed my mother pass away and was shaken by the experience of what felt like her sinking into nothingness during the gradual cooling down of her body. This encounter with entropy, this grief, forcefully pushed me to use any means I had available for trying to understand the ethics of living and dying together, and later how our institutions and social organizations and systems of knowledge structure are living and dying together. What's important to note is that the image of the animal here is not a metaphor for human passing. Rather, the euthanized horse is a being with whom I share a fundamental relationship with the world. We both are bodies, we both are selves, and because of these things, we both are vulnerable. The 25-minute video is edited from 9 hours of recording of what's best described as a kind of wake. What's left out of the picture, however, is the site of this wake, the grim, noisy facility where slaughterhouse leftovers and carcasses of domestic animals are brought and ground into protein powder that's fed back to farm animals. Thus, the animal doesn't enter my thinking as a radical alterity, though it does also pose a question about otherness. What's radical in the question of the animal, for me, is the way it forces us to think about vulnerability and ways in which beings are made into things and things into beings, and how what is projected onto animality is entangled with the ways in which some deaths are made grievable, while the deaths of some sustain the life of others. A later version of the piece shows 5 different animals of unedited durations, accompanied by a soundscape of low, continuous exhaling. The name of the work, Community, is an attempt to include the people witnessing the cooling down of the animal figures as part of the landscape of the work. It also points to the fact that the death of non-human animals is the foundation of modern cultures, something we're painfully aware of in this time of sixth mass extinction and climate collapse. Thinking of interspecies communality and developing methods for non-human political and legal representation is then a most urgent task. How then are we to ponder interspecies communality in the framework of Western societies? Donna Haraway famously coined the term nature cultures to capture the hybridity and interconnectedness of human and more than human life. But the core institutions of our society don't recognize such hybridity. In fact, the political community, as imagined in Western political theory, is built on rising above the state of nature, while this state of nature is imagined as a violent war zone of everybody against everybody. And as such, it also implicitly suggests that nature, or the pre-social condition, is by default predatory and acommunal. It is precisely this exclusion of the non-human realm that forms the foundation of the political community in Western imaginary. The Party of Others is a project I launched in 2011 in the wake of the parliamentary elections in Finland. The political climate was suddenly saturated with the xenophobic and othering language that followed the rise of white nationalist populism, while at the same time movements for expanding the realm of the political to include more than humans and other excluded groups were gaining traction in the political landscape. For the project, I interviewed people who represented the interests of the more than human world in their various practices and asked, what would a community without exclusion look like? What could be the system of governance of such an interspecies political community? The exhibition, which presents video and sound material from the interviews, explores the way in which language functions as a threshold for political participation in Western thought. But only certain kinds of language, the kind that has syntax and grammar, is accepted as language proper, and so most of the beings of the world are excluded from even uttering their desire to enter the political stage. And so I asked the people I was interviewing to refer to more than human beings with the pronoun them as a way to emphasize the possessiveness of a structure that relies on talking on behalf of the other. The rhetoric of what should we do with them or what do they need is resonant in many political campaigns for inclusion, while the challenge of including non-humans is more profound as they are never able to join our political community unless we radically rethink its foundations. On the other hand, the project was a proposal for a real political party that would represent radical, deep ecological views, and in that way move the window of discourse, the kind of Overton window, one might say, closer to the forest. As we know, modern law divides the world into two categories, that of persons, which is humans and human-made constructs, and things, which is then nearly everything else, including the more than human world. Animal rights movements and movements for the rights of nature attempt to develop legal tools for making the interests of more than human beings and entities even visible to law. While initiatives for the rights of nature often emerge from places with strong indigenous presence and spring from the notion of decolonization of the whole anthropocentric state apparatus and its hierarchies, animal rights theory, in contrast, tends to work through a notion of inclusion of individuals into the existing framework. An interesting recent example is the work of Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka, who propose expanding citizenship theory to non-human animals. Their proposal starts from the premise of accepting the interdependence of human and non-human lives and developing frameworks of rights that, like the different frameworks that regulate human-to-human interaction, are relationship-specific. In this view, non-human animals can be considered citizens, denizens, or having their own sovereign territories that need to be respected. Donaldson and Kymlicka draw from disability studies that foreground the fact that many of us are not capable of entering the logosphere of politics, yet do have interests. Concepts such as dependent agency or assisted agency that can also include nonverbal communication make room for political belonging that's not reserved only for those who can voice their concerns. The underlying issue, however, is that the state and its notion of citizenship and subjecthood is already not only anthropocentric and exclusive, but that the way the figure of the human at the center of Western political theory is constructed is already entangled with animalisation. Museum of Non-Humanity is a touring memorial museum that presents a history of the construction of the categories human and non-human in Western thought. The exhibit consists of an archive that presents evidence of the way in which humanity has been rhetorically distinguished from non-humanity through the course of history. The viewer can meditate on the violent history enabled by this conceptual separation in the melancholy space of the 11-screen, 70-minute exhibition, while the museum's future-looking programming brings together practitioners from the fields of social justice, environmental and animal rights struggles. Museum of Non-Humanity focuses specifically on one aspect of the non-human, namely the figure of the animal as the binary opposite of the human. In order to see how the figure of the animal operates within racial capitalism, I found it helpful to parse out 3 different conceptualizations of animality so that we are able to work in their intersection. First, there tends to be a divide between animal rights discourse and social justice discourse. This conflict can be traced back to their ways of conceptualizing the human-animal divide as a species divide. The term speciesism, popularized by Peter Singer, is commonly used in animal rights rhetoric. Singer argues that species-based discrimination operates like any other form of discrimination, such as racism or sexism, where an arbitrary signifier is made to mark the inferiority of a group. Singer leans on the moral theory of Kant, which defines the worth of human beings based on their ability for self-reflection and autonomy. Singer argues that if we take this as a starting point, and this is a highly problematic claim that slips from speciesism to ableism, the moral worth of many humans who do not possess these qualities should be then reconsidered too. On the opposite side of this species barrier, social justice struggles see that the problem is not so much the human-animal divide than the fact that it leaks, in other words, that some humans are being treated like animals. What follows is an unavoidable conflict where one group's rights challenge directly the other group's protection. Posthumanist discourse complicates this picture by noting that the figure of the human and the non-human are not in fact species constructs, but moral and juridical categories. Cora Diamond, for example, points out that moral categories are not created by observing differences, but by performative naming. Naming someone an animal constructs them as killable, while naming someone a human socially constructs them as protected. As Matthew Calarco notes, the question of the animal is in fact two questions. One concerns the conceptual human-animal binary, and the other are concrete relationships to other species. This line of thought is premised on the assumption that since humans are in fact animals, they have had to humanize themselves by rejecting their own animality. Giorgio Agamben famously calls this process the anthropological machine, a lethal process at the core of Western thought that tries to ceaselessly and forever unsuccessfully stabilize the distinction between humanity and its underlying animal body. Because the ideal of humanity is always already biased by culture and power relations, this caesura in the figure of the human makes it possible then to strip anyone at any given time of their humanity and reduce them to the non-human foundation. For Agamben, this operation at the heart of Western thought creates the conditions of possibility for genocides and extermination camps. In this view, racism, sexism, homo or transphobia are instances of animalization. All the historic divisions generated by the anthropological machine require the concept of animal as their reference. But the animality at play here has little, if anything, to do with the multitudes of non-human species and individuals. Rather, it's a theoretical abstraction that is already constructed through projecting onto it everything that is rejected from the racist, sexist, and so on ideal of man. And so posthumanist thought in its various forms expands this notion and argues that also other species and nature can be seen as being dehumanized through a logic that relies on an anthropocentric hierarchy. The last approach, and in my mind the most productive one, is developed by thinkers who approach the question of the animal from a decolonial perspective. The philosopher Sil Coe argues that in order to understand human-animal relations and the logic of animalization in the contemporary moment, it's necessary to include the optics of race. Coe states that even though animal abuse, as well as discrimination of humans, has always existed, the emergence of race in the wake of the colonization of the Americas radically transformed also human-animal relations. What Coe argues is that with the invention of race as hierarchies within the figure of the human, the animal as the binary opposite of human proper was accompanied by a new figure, that of the subhuman, the racialized human other. This figure was placed in the cosmic order somewhere between humans and animals. And so while racialization happens through animalization, that's based on the assumed proximity of the so-called subhuman with the literal non-human animals, also animals are racialized through their proximity to the so-called subhuman. So the subhuman and the animal become two faces of the binary opposite of the white supremacist human proper in Western imaginary. Che Gossett writes with regards to the tendency of animal rights movements to treat the struggle for rights as a linear progression, and I quote, "It is as though animal is the new black, even though blackness has already been racialized through animalization." End quote. Manesha Dekha notes similarly how resorting to equal human rights is not possible if the ideal of the human has already been constructed by excluding from it racialized others. Silko builds a powerful argument for what she calls black veganism as a form of resistance to all forms of animalization that are based on colonial white supremacist notions of humanity. In the light of this, it's clear that it's not possible to fight racial capitalism without fighting the logic of animalization. Humanity and animality are not species categories. Some animals are indeed white and privileged, while a widening majority of the world's populations of all species is being reduced to a disposable mass that sustains the accumulation of wealth for the few. Capitalism needs non-human, subhuman, and inhuman resources. The surplus is literally extracted from someone's body. To think of the question of the animal through the optics of animalization allows for thinking of constructive forms of resistance at the intersection of race and animality. Despite his investment in the logic of animalization, Agamben is not really interested in the fate of non-human animals. But perhaps the case is not that the facilities of animal agriculture are camps alongside other camps. Perhaps it's animality itself that is the site on which a camp, any camp, can be built on. And because it's a foundation, it itself remains invisible, even when it reaches massive proportions. Carol Adams points to the fact that the animals we consume are most often female animals. Thus, the sites of animal agriculture are sites of gendered violence and coerced reproduction. It's the female animal, both human and more than human, that literally sustains capitalism with her labor. Perhaps this is one of the reasons animal agriculture is still not fully politicized. Consider the fact that a mind-blowing 41% of the land of continental USA is occupied by animal agriculture, almost half of the country. The all-American burger is in fact a colonial weapon for grabbing indigenous lands. And while the world was grieving for the 1.25 billion animals that perished in the wildfires in Australia, 8 billion die every year in the US alone as a normal state of affairs. The grief over Australian wildlife grows out of a sense of unnecessary tragedy, that they died for nothing, even when we're talking about sheep and other domestic animals that were in fact raised just to be killed. But animals in animal agriculture die for profit, and so profiting from violence is one way of making killable by removing deaths from the realm of tragedy. How to make this 8 billion or the tens of billions globally also an urgency, an ongoing crisis. For Waiting Room, we tried to capture something of this simultaneous invisibility and pervasiveness of animal agriculture. The accompanying video installation is an accumulative archive of language that starts from the concepts of terror and terrorism, and investigates ways in which state-sanctioned violence is sustained by projecting this violence on its subjects and those who attempt to break free. Now, this sounds like I'm going to make so-called dreaded comparison, but please bear with me. Hannah Arendt wrote that Adolf Eichmann was first and foremost a functionary. He didn't necessarily like what he did, even felt bad about it, but he was committed to his role of being part of the apparatus. But Arendt also writes that she observed there being a certain pleasure in his being a functionary. And perhaps this pleasure function is overlooked when forms of oppression are observed only through a lens of utilitarian interest. In his study on sadomasochism, Deleuze notes how sadism and masochism are in fact incompatible. While a masochist obviously wants a sadist, the sadist doesn't want a real masochist because where's the fun if they enjoy it? But from a psychoanalytic perspective, what drives both desires is a need to break free from the grip of the superego. For the sadist, this means a state of lawlessness, a Desadian institution without law, whereas for the masochist, this means a childlike letting go of all responsibility. What emerges is a desire for a particular psychological state of freedom, experienced as gratifying freedom from morality and responsibility. Perhaps forms of oppression are entangled with this desire, where the realm of non-humanity or animality functions as a way to create lacunas where, to use Agamben's words, anything becomes possible, not only for the sake of material gains, but for this sense of freedom itself. In conversation with Marcia Gessen, Judith Butler says of Trump, and quote, "He is a sovereign, unchecked by the rule of law he represents, and many think that is the most free and courageous kind of liberation. But it is liberation from all social obligation, a self-aggrandizing sovereignty of the individual." End quote. How are we then to redirect this desire and pay more attention to the way in which we conceptualize freedom? Che Gosset writes with reference to Black liberation and what they call animal necropolitics that, quote, "as a process of becoming with," and they're following Haraway's notion of becoming with as a form of planetary relation. "As a process of becoming with, abolition is the unfinished project of ending anti-Black racism, racial capitalism, anti-trans, anti-queer, patriarchal policing, colonialism, animal killing, and caging." End quote. Abolitionism, in this wide sense, ties together racialization as animalisation and caging as a vehicle for making race, making animal, and making killable. By working through the concept of abolition, Gosset points towards freedom as the ultimate goal of intersectional ecology. The notion of freedom presented here is not, however, the solipsistic, autonomous individual described in Western thought, but rather freedom to form relationships, to bond, and to build communities. In her recent work on radical nonviolence, Butler points out how our self-realization happens through relations, and so when we violate another, we also violate those relations and thus also part of ourselves. The assumed autonomy, ability, and individuality of even a normative-bodied human are at best a temporal condition. We're much better characterized by dependency, interdependency, and being differently abled at different times of our lives. Our existence is radically interdependent. Following Butler, when we cage beings, be it human or modern human beings, we cut them off from this most fundamental form of self-realization. We literally amputate their being. The world of climate justice, then, has to be a world without cages. Fuck cages. Hannah Arendt also writes how history doesn't proceed in linear cause and effect formation like it seems in retrospect, but in ruptures and breaks that are unpredictable. This is true in the microscale of art practice as well. You work with what life brings to you. Some years ago, I faced a personal life crisis. Right after the collapse of a relationship, I was diagnosed with a serious illness. In order to process what I was going through, I started taking photographs and posting them on a fetish site my lover and I used to hang out on. Facing a real threat to my life and experiencing the heightened fragility of my body, the imagery of the theaters of objectification and dominance started to feel more problematic, as if too much closeness to reality would shatter the distance that makes pleasure possible. I didn't make these images for an art audience. What motivated me instead was a raw and desperate need to express, heightened by an awareness in the face of my possible death that everything in my subjective experience, its details and colors, memories and fears, aspirations and hopes would disappear with me. That this thing that I take for granted, that the world opens to me as something and carries significance and meaning in these particular ways, is not any external objective reality, but my reality, a world that I have created as a world, and that would not survive my passing. I bring this series up despite it being a little uncomfortable because I think it's important for our conversations to remember that there is knowledge that we can only access experientially, or that the experience is what gives our thinking its fulfillment. Audre Lorde refers to rationality as a road. If it doesn't come from somewhere and lead to somewhere, it is useless. This somewhere is the fleshy reality of embodiment. And so underlying all ethical discourse is this deeply experiential awareness that inside this body, that's just an object amongst objects, exists an internality, that I carry a world within me, that I am someone. And as someones, what we share is our worry over our bodies, which means worrying about these immensely precious worlds that we're given to guard. This condition puts us in a place where managerial approaches to ethics fall apart because there's radical equality in that condition. Not characteristics like autonomy or rationality, but the simple fact that we, all of us, as someone's, experience life as something is what makes us vulnerable. The life of a pig on a hog farm is as precious to it as mine is to me. So to live ethically is not to blindly follow rules laid out by some utilitarian principle. Your mother on one train track and 3 strangers on the other, what will you do? But to accept the weight of the daunting unsolvability of the task. What radical equality of lives means is that quantitative approaches are always violent. Because ethics starts where we acknowledge that there are worlds that live inside fragile bodies, and the crime of the worst acts of mass violence towards both humans and non-humans is to deny this internality, to deny that there is anything but the body, and thus also to deny that there is anything ethical to consider. To live ethically is to carry the awareness of this radical equality of life, and that in spite of this, we have to make decisions, including decisions that kill. And it must be stressed here that to think of the radical equality of lives, including the lives of those non-humans who are selves, does not mean mobilizing a racist slogan like all life matters. As Butler points out, the radical equality of lives is situated in a world where some lives are considered more valuable and more grievable than others. And how we think of animality reflects back to all these other moral divisions. The place of struggle and resistance is always in making grievable those lives that are placed outside ethical consideration. Now, I want to pause and talk a little bit about art and politics. We usually approach art from the perspective of the traditions of aesthetics, which sees art as a certain kind of doing and making, in other words, as form. What I, as an artist, have found myself struggling with is that to think of art as production of forms effectively dismisses the artist as someone who has any expertise on art. It's true that the artist doesn't have any special authority over the meanings their work carries. But what this notion misses is that art is not only doing and making, it is also, and I argue most importantly, a way of being. What I mean is that in the background of any making and doing of art, there's a certain openness towards the world that is necessary for the practice, or I might say, is the practice. You need to let the world in, to let it move you, touch you, to have intimacy with the world in a way not so unlike the intimacy we experience in our interpersonal relationships. Intimacy creates a space where it becomes possible to be vulnerable and to have a more direct relationship with the world. In this, vulnerability is not a weakness, but an ability to be open and be moved by an encounter. What I argue is that this kind of relationality is already present in art practice. Art is not so much what I do and make, but rather an active relationship, an ongoing dialogue with the world. That's why work often feels like being with a friend or a lover. It soothes the need to connect because it is its own kind of a connection. It's a kind of thinking together with oneself, which really is thinking together with the world, letting the world think within me. This relationship cannot be reduced to the artwork, to the making and doing part. The artwork is rather a shelter that protects art as training in the practice of vulnerability. Before any work is done, art is already an encounter. Saying this, I'm not resorting to romantic ideas of the artist as an exceptional being. What I'm pointing towards is that we all have a need to exist artistically, to be open and vulnerable in ways that art makes possible, independent of whether we create or experience art. So instead of asking what the political task of art is, we could think of art as a need, in the same way as we think of forming deep connections as a need, perhaps a need that's shared by other species too. The goal of the struggle is not to achieve mastery. The goal is to build a world that allows us to exist in our interdependence and openness. How might we work towards a society in which everybody would have the safety that's necessary in order to access this relational way of being? Because is there anything more radical in our world than unproductive, vulnerable existing? Institutions are sites of upholding social fictions that determine the destinies of bodies. Creating imaginary institutions is a way to critique existing institutions and make visible their limitations and discriminatory premises. But more importantly, it's a way to create alternative fictions that bypass the fictions the world is currently run by, fictions of money, of nations, of humanity, of law. A memorial museum for the human-animal binary, or a political party for the more than human, reflect back to the world and temporarily recreate the world as a place where these alternative fictions rule. And so what these liminal temporal spaces can hail into being is also new kinds of subjectivities that inhabit these fictions. What kinds of humans do we need to become for another kind of a world to emerge? What kind of a world do we need to build for another kind of humanity to be born? A world where vulnerability takes the place of mastery, freedom to bond the place of autonomy, and celebration of difference in abilities the place of ontological hierarchies. Becoming is a new installation that explores this moment of becoming otherwise. It's premised on the idea that whatever is to come is already here, emergent, waiting to be noticed and grown. Instead of projecting a future, we focus on the moment of transformation and the different modalities change happens through. Based on interviews with 37 people around us whom we admire and whose practices are in one way or another cultivating seeds of a way of being that has been shadowed by the patriarchal white supremacist anthropocentric order, Becoming asks what should be cultivated here and now for another kind of world to emerge. It doesn't lay out a single argument. Its scale and duration prevents any single idea from dominating. Instead, we think of it as a place that's built on attachment and lived community, and that opens up to welcome others to think and become together with the interviewees and with the landscapes they inhabit. I'll end with a short trailer of this work that is an immersive 3-screen video installation. The song is by the indigenous Inari Sami educator and singer Anna Morottaja, and it's about a peaceful place.
How to know is engagement with the world, the physicality of the world. When I walk around, I touch things. I want to see what they feel like. I want to see their texture, their color. The only way to know is to use your senses, all that you have, to develop them as fully as you can, and then touch and then take it in.
I think that some people need to claim the human. I think that's really important. And when I say people, I mean specifically like Europeans, white people. And I don't mean this as white people as a whole, but like specifically those who have benefit from the category of whiteness need to claim the human. Because I think that there's something really detrimental about just throwing the human away. I think that if we throw the human away, we sort of there's this possibility of like reenacting the same mistakes that we've already committed. But at the same time, where I see us going, especially when I think about myself and I think about my people, or the people that I claim, or the things or organism, creatures that I claim as belonging in my community, I guess I see us going somewhere completely different. I really see us imagining something new.
Like, what does it mean to not be sure? What does it mean to not know what we're seeing before we even see them? What does it mean to speak before we know what language should be?
If you're holding in common, a community which is holding in common something, there would be this whole process of co-producing, co-caring of responsibility, of co-governing around the commons. And then, of course, holding certain principles high in terms of equality and democracy.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the discussion. And now I would like to invite the roundtable discussants.
Will you do the introductions for the speakers, Aria?
Yeah, I will. I just lost all the cursor right now. So without further ado, I would like to invite Evan Kurtzi first. Evan, he is an American anthropologist and has recently published a book called The Mutant Project, which also focuses on the ethics of CRISPR and genetic modifications on human genes. And he has also came and gave a talk at the NonHumanity lab earlier, a couple months ago. And you can also find out more about his book and his talk on our YouTube channel as well. And the next discussant, Hemant Sareen. He's a New Delhi-based artist, editor, and writer. And he has been working on contemporary art, photography, and moving images. He has also taught classes at Ambedkar University on globalization and photography. His work which is a solo show on Zoo Poetics in 2013, focused on and asking questions on the link between perceptual environments, ecology, and science and photography to examine the human-animal relations. He has recently increasingly engaged in archival research and connections between enlightenment, colonialism, modernity, and nature, and especially where they intersect institutions like zoo, natural museums, and public parks. And our last discussant is Maya Kopskaya, our curator, founder, and director of the Animality lab. She is currently teaching at Chiang Mai University and has a long experience in multispecies, anthropocene studies, science and technology, and society. And her most recent, well, one of the most recent work is researching and focusing on the anthropocentric, which also asks the philosophical questions of our relations with the more than human world and this Anthropocene. And you could also find out more about her research and articles online and through our website, which will be released and published soon. She has done many research in St. Petersburg and also lived in China and India for many decades as well. So now I will pin the discussant to join us and we'll have a lively discussion. So any participants that you have questions or comments, you can also leave them in the chat box for now, and then we will bring you to the discussion maybe about 20 minutes from now.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me into this dialogue and for a talk that was a real tour de force. In this talk, I see multiple competing trajectories of becoming and also unbecoming. In the final images, we encountered rust, decay, and the haunting afterlives of processes that were actualized or not. I saw thousands of intensities, also thousands of plateaus coming together, some which were visible and visualized, but others which were in the realm of the invisible. And I think, in trying to respond, I might just make one question to the speaker. Going back to the very opening moments of the talk when we were encountering entropy, the animal, the human that's sinking into nothingness, and this image of the horse that's hot becoming cold, In part, I'm wondering what would happen if that image was shot on a longer time scale, as Annie Sprinkle and Beth Stevens remind us, compost is hot. So I'm wondering, if that horse was let to not only get cold, but then re-enliven itself as it unbecomes with a multitude of microbes and protists and fungi. How we might think of the liveliness of these other domains that are largely invisible, but that nonetheless have that relation to entropy and non-entropy. And I might also ask what happens if we substitute one word, all for some, in a key sentence towards the beginning of the talk. In thinking about animal capital, you suggested the death of some sustain the life of others. But as Val Plumwood and Deborah Bird-Rose and other Australian ecofeminist philosophers have insisted, as much as we might try to embalm bodies or preserve them in the afterlife, other kinds of life invariably creep in. Some of us can afford to bury bodies 6 feet deep and not have our bodies scavenged as carrion. But even those of us who can afford that kind of burial, there's no way of really stopping that process of unbecoming and decay that is generative and lively. So, what happens if we take that key sentence and transform it from the death of some sustain the life of others? Again, with Debbie Bird-Rose, Val Plumwood, thinking about the death of all that might sustain the life of others.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. And yeah, I love that Compost is Hot. I love their work. And I guess the work Entropy is really about grief and the fact that we don't experience natural processes as just natural processes. We live through our attachment with the world, and that, like, letting go and accepting that we're part of this process is a pretty intense emotional roller coaster that we're on. And that I think that acceptance of letting that go, or like I say, grief is the signal of attachment, and that without attachment we wouldn't maybe have grief. And I know there's a lot of traditions, philosophical and spiritual traditions, that are really like working on this particular question of attachment. But that work is really about that emotional register. And instead of like record, I thought that at the time I would use this sort of cold scientific media to show not really something about the natural process, but to find a way to materialize or make tangible the incredible mystery that I experience as a subject, as a human person who lives inside my consciousness when I see something, when I see the consciousness, the mind, the subjectivity of another slip away, and that unchangeability of entropy where I can't bring them back. I just can't bring them back, and how desperately heartbreaking it is. And that is really what the content of the work is. And I think it's a beautiful idea that you could record the life coming back, but I think then that would have to follow the tempo of grief. So maybe that would have to be a process of 2 years where I really would, have that wake with the animal, and then also sit with that, and then that work would have to be like 2 years long, because otherwise you would make symbolic something that I don't think, it's like that emotional impact. It's like it's something different. And I did record that animal for 9 hours, so it was a different experience doing that. And I always felt that I don't know if I'm very happy with editing the duration into 25 minutes as a like easily digestible, and that's why I then made new works that were unedited durations, and that but that's a different question. So I think that that's kind of my answer to why not. That would be a different, and maybe this is something where, like, as an artist, I I think that what I'm trying to somehow always keep present is the fact that we don't, when we work with questions of the non-human world, I don't want to be a scientist, you know, I don't want to move myself away like I do. And I think everybody, you know, all life has some kind of like emotional register, you know, we have attachments, like all life forms maybe have some kinds of responses to attachment and loss. And that is an important part of like what life is about. And I don't want to like move away from that register. And so I think, yeah, that, you know, sometimes I forefront that in with the expense of like making very precise, you know, scientifically precise work. Then the question about like all life, I think that's like, it's the same question, is that, yeah, for sure, all, like that there's a cycle of life where death, you know, all death for some will always become a life for some others, you know. So that's a really complicated question of like whose life we forefront. And I think I would be really interested in hearing how you think about this, because I feel like many times when I talk about non-human animals and I try to talk about animal agriculture or things like this, there's always someone who comes up with the question of what about plants? And then I'm like, yeah, sure, what about plants? Like, it's an important conversation, but no one makes that remark when we talk about the rights of children, you know. What about plants? There is a boundary, we don't. So what are the spaces in which we talk about different kinds of oppression and different kinds of vulnerability and killability, while acknowledging that these categories are still constructed and problematic in themselves.
Yeah, and if I might, just a couple of follow-up questions.
Yeah.
You know, I think in part it's a much broader question about how to live with unbecoming, how to live with toxic relations that are present in the world but unescapable, how to live, you know. There's a great talk that Jake Kosek gives about you know, the haunted landscapes of the radioactive Southwest, and he's traveling in a car with a worker at one of these plants that has been employed at this place that generates toxicity and radioactive afterlives. And she compares it to a bad relationship with a bad ex-boyfriend, and she can't escape it. Like, it's her conditions of life, it's her conditions of employment. And, you know, I think that kind of ongoing bad relation can stand in for so many others in a world where, you know, so many of us turn the ignition key of an automobile on a daily basis. You know, so many of us travel in airplanes. You know, we're all unbecoming in some way. You know, as Alison Kafier celebrates in her queer Crip and feminist manifesto, we're all becoming disabled. We're all becoming different people after a certain point in our lives. So how to live with these differently embodied experiences of violence. You gesture to this and make some quite compelling arguments related to racial capitalism, but also how this cuts along speciesist and species lines. And, you know, I think you're giving us a vision of a world that's not transcendent, where we can't escape these thousands of other intensities and becomings and unbecomings, but we might do, in the idiom of this forum, some worlding work that's different. So these are maybe comment questions to just also put on the table.
Thank you.
Hemant, would you like to offer some of your thoughts?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Terike. Loved your talk. Just a breathtaking, you know, range of references, and you almost covered the whole entire field and brought in so much other things related to animals and becoming. But I see your work still situated in Western discourse, and though we are very much we consume that in India. Culturally and traditionally, we have another baggage to carry, and which is tradition, which comes, modernity and break from certain tradition, but those ideas still remain in our head. So I'll talk about Wendy Doniger and what she writes about the, Indic civilization and the beginnings, what kind of relationships we began with, and which are kind of continuing, but they're also changing with the animal, with each other. And in India, we had this concept of animal and man being fungible, and both were sacrificial beings, and so were plants. And so in the chain of succession, we began with man being sacrificed, and then came the animals. Especially there were the bull, the billy goat, the ram. And then later on came flowers and coconuts, things which were vegetative. And in Manusmriti, one of the basic texts which is rejected on many reasons now, there were two types of animals: one which were hunted, and one which were sacrificed. And so many of these categories have become obsolete. Animals are still sacrificed in places. I was in Goa recently, and I was told that there are so few black cats in Goa because they tend to be sacrificed. That was a shock to me. So there are still remnants of a culture I thought that had phased away. And the other thing that I've forgotten the point there, but yes, about there are certain things which are very new to us. Some relationships with animals, and something very trivial, or in our parlance, like a cat. So we are still newly entering into new ethical questions. So our experiential experience with animals is just beginning. Our questions are beginning to rise, unless we just draw on theoretical knowledge. I'm talking about praxis. And something like cat, cat is a very new phenomenon, and it became more, more people became cat moms or cat dads after internet. Cat became popular. And I also noticed how internet cats were so few in the beginning. The phenomenon was so limited. New York Times had the 5 famous cats. Maru from Japan was one of them. So it was also about globalization, cats from different countries. And in India, I remember somebody telling me about a woman who came to buy a cat from a pet store. And she asked the person selling the cat that, does this thing fall ill? So she is just at the beginning of many discoveries, including that cats are not just cute. They do many other things. And controlling their reproductivity, things like that, which are very ethical questions. And and the other thing that's new here is, optically engaging with animal. So in the cities, it's, I saw one of the birds that we always hear in Delhi, but never see. I saw that in my early 40s. It's a barbet. It's a very common bird. And similarly, cats were, I've never even looked at cats. till my late 30s. And that process began, and then something happened. But a new thing that's beginning in India, which is a huge phenomenon, and which was recently came into fore in environmental protests, which is bird watching. So photography and looking and unmaking of the animal, basically. So we are that's a process now which is taking over from one which from fungibility or being one with the animals has slowly through modernization, through urbanity, it kind of became obsolete, those thoughts, and animal became a competitor for resources, a pest, or used for labor and for consuming. And the other thing is that also in India we had a prayer which is still said before a meal in some parts of India, which is it is Brahma Arpanam, Brahma Havir, Brahmagnam, which is that the one who is offering the food to God is Brahma. So Brahma is offering food to Brahma, and the food itself is Brahma. So Brahma is consuming Brahma. So basically, you are bringing in something. It's a bit like Qurbani, or like in Islam, you sacrifice the goat in the name of God. So culture and animal is very much connected in India, and the new trend of cat is another kind of modernization. It's a step in modernity of being independent and having a cat. Families don't allow cats, or seldom did earlier. And so I come from this kind of baggage. And even I started very recently engaging with cats, which was my beginning into my curiosity into animals. And I when I see how far I've come, it's kind of frightening. So from this perspective, the Western very developed way of looking at things, very very categorized, that is that comes into fore, and also the separation of man and animal, the animal being a problem, is very new to us. Till throughout the 70s, or throughout the beginnings of heavy industrial urbanization in the 70s, we had a monkey problem in Delhi. And I remember it was very, very humanely dealt with. There was a specialist in apes who spent so much energy and gave so much knowledge to the local administrations to look at this problem more humanely. And then that was transferred to this kind of a humane attitude towards animal, to dogs. So I think it was 10 or maybe 15 years back when it became illegal to move dogs out of a locality. So India has, I think, one of the a few countries in the world which have stray animals still on the street. I went to Japan and with a friend who had not been to Japan for some time, and she was shocked to find animals missing on the street that she was used to, stray animals like cats and dogs. So we still have that, and the administration posts, has posters of saying that in summer, please offer water or food to animals. Which is unthinkable in Japan or in Hong Kong, it's a law to feed, law against to feed feral cats, and this became something very. I mean, I understood this separation, this otherness in Europe when I was doing a residency there in Antwerp. I mean, it was the height of, I never understood how, Western thought separates man and animal. And it became very clear there, and it was shocking. So there was a jackdaw which was limping, and it used to limp, and we used to give it food. And then, wild rats came and started nibbling at the same food. And there was a Irish gentleman who thought that the rat could easily come inside. And then the residency had to call the pest exterminator. So they came from the civil administration, and I negotiated with them that maybe the rats will stay outside, they won't come in. But they said that it's a job, they'll have to do it. So they kind of put some chemical to kill the cats, and the next day the whole garden was full of birds, dead birds, including the jackdaw, which we used to feed. So this kind of total othering of the animal, and it having no place in, modernity, excluding animal altogether. So this was kind of new to me. And there was another thing of a zoo in Antwerp, on the outskirts, which has more space for humans than it has for animals, parking and then restaurants. And one of the tigers escaped and she was shot dead. And this was a big story in Europe. Like, people are saying, they wanted to go for early lunch, they shot him. So questions like these become very, very strange to us. And so even the discourse, we have to think about it again, from my perspective, and maybe bring in some of our discourse.
Thank you, Hemant, for bringing in a perspective from the non-Western tradition. Terike, I'm sure there's a million different strands that you could connect to with some of the things that Hemant has said. Do you want to respond to any of those? Any thoughts about any of those issues?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a really, really central and valuable point, and that's obviously something that I'm sure many people who are, are located and work in the Western context and are, brought up by that context are struggling with, because there's, of course, even in Finland, there's a lot of artists and scholars and people working who are Sami, indigenous Sami, and who have a very vibrant and very crucial view to these issues that is not about at all even about deconstructing, our Western notions of humanity or animality, but just being able to express and live according to their cosmology. So what is my role in actually thinking through these enlightenment-based or Western notions that really are harmful and are, I guess, how to work on this in a way that doesn't then occupy and, take out all the oxygen from other perspectives that might be much more productive in this moment. But I think, coming to your question about the animal, I think it's really interesting, those examples that you showed, and I absolutely agree also with that. I think that in the Western world, this distinction is completely illusionary. There is no such thing as a distinction between human and animal. This is just something that philosophers sort of came up with, and then we think that this is what's happening, but actually what's happening is mass scale intimacy and closeness with non-human animals in all levels of society. And that's why, in my current thinking, I'm trying to move away from even thinking through concepts such as human or animal or even anthropocentrism, because I don't think that they actually represent what's happening in the world in a way that, we talk about you know, in a lot of like ecosexual conversations or some post-humanist conversations, that there's a distinction, you know, of course there's a conceptual distinction between human and animal or nature culture. But the way I see it is that actually that distinction, that conceptual distinction, has enabled a mass scale intimacy and closeness with non-human animals. And I think kind of like sexuality or physical intimacy is a good example, that we think that we have to somehow revive a sensual relationship with the non-humans, and we have to learn to, you know, be in a more intimate way with the non-human or the more than human world, where at the same time you have 2 or 1.5 billion cows on the planet who have a human hand up there, as you know, every year, you know, that level of intimacy that actually is happening all the time. So it's not like that intimacy doesn't exist. It just it's coercive, and it's non-consensual, and it's alienated in many ways. But then another thing that I think there's a like thinking through, and I would really love to hear your all of your views on this, because I felt that instead of like thinking that what the Enlightenment philosophy, which I think a lot of, I'm not a scholar in the field, so I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of work that's done that I'm not aware of, but I feel a lot of the criticism towards Western traditions actually critique Enlightenment thinkers, when the practices, you know, through Western history might have been materially quite different. And so that's why I'm trying to think through like Marxist frameworks or historical materialism, or think through like capitalist critique of capitalism in a way of like actually trying to see what are the material conditions in the expansion and in the birth and expansion of capitalism, that is actually the unifying thread, not so much the philosophy that usually happens, you know, afterwards. We start to create, you know, mythology around practices, but what is the praxis? And then maybe to see that, you know, what we actually maybe share with, you know, with the West and with other cultures, or Westernized or cultures that are not in the process of, you know, like you say, being influenced by Western thinking, but they're still, you know, we're still embedded in these different forms of capitalism, and through the framework of capitalism, you can see that actually, and this is kind of where I'm at, power doesn't care what species you are. It cares about whether you can reproduce. It cares about whether you can create matter. It cares about whether you are, you know, what kind of labor is your body suited for? Like, are you willing to cooperate or not, you know? And then when we look at the work of non-human animals in factories, or the work of non-human animals in the early industrial time, or when we look at like how the human animal binary works in legislation, it's sort of arbitrary. It's like it can go either way. It's like you can be exploited because you're human, or you can be protected because you're human. Like it doesn't really follow those distinctions. Like human exceptionalism doesn't really, like these examples of like there's a prisoner in Guantanamo who is not acknowledged as a person by the US Supreme Court, you know. At the same time, there's a iguana outside the cell who's also not considered a person, but is protected by an Endangered Species Act. So you have these very complex assemblages of like who belongs and who doesn't belong, that don't actually follow. You can't really unpack it through thinking of human supremacy. And I think that's really kind of complex to try to get your head around, and try to get your head around in a way where you don't lose some grounding to make some kind of moral arguments, you know, and not to just somehow think that everything's a little, you know, like how do we anchor some kind of like ethical guidelines or moral decisions in actual situations in anti-capitalist resistance that is still that is still somehow acknowledging the nuances and doesn't flatten the differences, but is still able to make some real contribution to the struggle, which I think it would be really important. But I'd really love to hear you talk more on this, all the three of you.
I actually have a bunch of questions. However, it looks like Eben has been chafing to say something. Maybe you have had some. Looks like you've had some moments where you maybe had something to add.
No, actually, I see.
Before I take us to a different train of thought.
Go ahead, Maya. And there's also a question in the chat that just popped up.
Oh, it did. Okay, you know, we can take that even first. I will read that. Hold on. If there's a question in the chat, that's awesome. Okay, Pietro, will you just read your own question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the amazing talk and presentation. Yeah, I was just wondering, you know, in our times of ecological decays and species extinction, which includes human, how can we carefully tread and move away from what can be seen as a fixation on security, right? The idea that also humans, we are in danger, of course. A security that is a human goal, normally that is achieved through actions, right? So it's a sort of a human preoccupation to allowing for these diverse responses that include complex humans and non-humans relations. I wonder, what can true form of transspecies solidarity look like? You know, this idea of transspecies solidarity. Terike, you've touched on many of those through your work, but through your years of experience, you come into a certain type of conclusion, or you just accepting that it's a very challenging endeavor, and maybe, you know, accepting failure, and also it's a way to move forward. Thank you.
Maybe I'll, if I understood correctly, that was addressed to me, but I'd love to hear others also. Maybe my short answer would be, at this point in my thinking, which probably is not a good blanket solution for everything, but I think there's something about ownership relations to bodies in general that that leads to a lot of issues, and I think that's kind of where I would start thinking of property relations and unpacking all property relations with bodies. And maybe that then, you know, when we think of agriculture and, you know, plants and stuff like that, then it becomes more complex. But in the animal kingdom, maybe we can think of unpacking property relations also to our own bodies, and thinking of existence as an animal in different way, in a more relational way. And I think then we could maybe start to think, if this was the goal, instead of animal rights, human rights, thinking like something that's tied to these ontological categories that I think are not really working, because power doesn't really work that way anyway. So to use these terms doesn't really do the thing we want, because we tried and it doesn't work. But to think of like unpacking or deconstructing property relations, or our relationship to our bodies as property, or bodies in general as property relations, then we might be able to address questions of both human and non-human exploitation and suffering in a way that it doesn't get stuck with those ontological categories. And that's kind of where I'm trying to think now, or where I think could be one productive area to move towards. I know that this is also problematic when it comes to environmental justice or eco-centric farming traditions, and a lot of like small scale farming that is, you know, like in global south or in different places that exist like on the peripheries of mass industrial capitalism, where actually having your small farm or having a few animals is essential for human existence traditionally. So I also don't want to think that imposing a blanket solution for everything is the solution.
Maybe to follow on that thread before Damian's question, which is a good one and connects with the question that I'm going to ask as well, which is what positive kind of intimacy between species could look like. I think that connects with the question I was going to ask about. You talked about a commons, and I would like to think about what co-governing a multi-species commons would look like. What would that commons look like? Drawing on my Indian experience, and when Hemant talked about the monkey problem, we have still today a large feral rhesus macaque population in New Delhi, which I thought was so cool and cute when I first got there. I was like, wow, this is amazing. There's monkeys everywhere. Look, they're outside on my balcony. And until one day I was held hostage in my kitchen by a very aggressive juvenile, I think, basically the equivalent of a teenage, fully grown and raging with hormones, but maybe not yet of mating, had not yet found a mate. So sort of an out of control, wild, and very typical teenage rhesus macaque boy who cornered me in my kitchen for 45 minutes while he trashed it. And I realized that the idea of the commons and of multi-species coexistence isn't simply about, extending love and care for others, but in fact, that there are questions about how our conditions of coexistence are not simply a matter of not, let's say, engaging in unnecessarily gratuitously violent and painful killing that's intended, like as in factory farms, which we could absolutely change and would alleviate a lot of suffering, but that a great deal of the violence that goes on is a different kind of violence that emerges simply from us living the kinds of lives we live, and lives that fragment the habitats of multiple species, that create new types of niche-making possibilities for certain species that are able to thrive in urban spaces and have a different agenda from, let's say, human beings and others, and even a different agenda from some of the other species in the city that they are maybe pushing out or having conflicts with. I had a crow family that lived in my neem tree on my balcony. I lived on the top floor, and that neem tree crow family came to my rescue and eventually drove the monkey away and kept sentry points around my barsati on the roof for hours afterwards, scolding, and he was several buildings down, still kind of checking things out, scolding and screaming at him, "You better stay away," because I happened to feed them breakfast. So these relations of different layers of intimacy, different types of connections. I'm trying to think, like, what would the commons for me and the macaques in the city and my family of crows in my neighborhood, and then other creatures, whether they were the packs of feral dogs and cats that would live, as Hemant talked about, or the cows, the starving cows that are, living with staple pins from tea bags in their throat because they live off of garbage, that are living down the street. What is our commons? How do we actually construct that? Because I think the idea of a co-constructed commons that is multi-species is a beautiful idea, but how do we enact that in practice? And that brought me to the question that relates to what Damian asked about what kind of positive intimacy between species could exist. I appreciated the examples that you gave of non-consensual, I'm not even sure if intimacy, it's sort of a violation of the very idea of intimacy, right? That sort of contains consensuality in it, but it is a kind of extreme violent closeness when, artificial insemination and all of the various bodily practices that go on, or even the well-intended practices like neutering our pets so they don't, our family, animals, so that they don't procreate and create millions of unwanted babies that then are euthanized or thrown on the street or abused, etc., or culled, as they are in China on a regular basis when they get to be too many stray cats and dogs in the neighborhood, that people just come around and kill millions of them on a regular basis under the rubric of pest control. so thinking about what would constitute this multi-species commons, that is a commons for more than just us humans, and what kind of relationality could exist within those commons that could bear the weight of our understanding that we live together and we share the world together, but it's not always an easy, comfortable sharing of the world. Like the mosquitoes carrying the virus that gave me dengue fever in Delhi that I almost died from, or you know, our friend, the novel coronavirus, you know, all of these different coexistences touch us in really radically different ways. And so I'm wondering, how do we then fine grain our thinking about that? And I like what you had to say about sort of rejecting the Cartesian move of mind-body dualism, and also rejecting Heidegger's sort of infamous and empirically groundless idea that animals are poor in world, right? And therefore, you know, they don't have selves and we don't have to give a shit about them because they don't really matter. But in fact, thinking of all beings as experiencing the world and having a self that is invested in living in the world and living a certain type of life that makes sense for that organism. How do we bring all of that together into a question about a commons, about a multi, I like to think about a multi-species polity, but what exactly would that be? And I agree that going beyond animal rights, legal work, someone like Stephen Wise, who is doing amazing work, let's say right now on a landmark case for an elephant named Happy, who is now being heard, you know, for legal personhood and to be freed from the solitary confinement in a small, nasty zoo. This kind of work obviously has very meaningful impacts on individual creatures and even species, possibly. But obviously, I agree with you that we can't stop at a sort of neoliberal notion of the self that is actually, in fact, rooted in Roman law and in the, you know, so it's Lockean theories of rights and democratic rights that were the sort of founding ideas that led to liberal notions of democracy, that the first sense of property is the ownership of the self, and that citizenship also was connected to ownership of other kinds of property, including often women and other humans. And but that the ownership of the self was the model of selfhood. Obviously, I think that model is part of the problem that needs to be deconstructed and replaced with something else. So art bringing us back to the embodied experience of being a being that experiences the world and is invested in living in the world, and creating some kind of context for openness to that world to come in to touch our lives and have intimacy with it, is a beautiful, beautiful, very moving idea. But I'm just wondering where you feel like the boundaries, like where do the boundaries lie in practice? Where are real obstacles when it comes to things like the mosquitoes or the, you know, as Hemant talked about, the rats, that people, the things that we want to pathologize or don't like and don't want, as opposed to the, you know, sort of easily romanticizable, more charismatic, cute, fuzzy, lovable critters that we like to, you know, call members of our fur family and things like that. How do we get beyond sort of the things that are convenient for us to other forms of life? What kind of commons and intimacy of other beings would be a better model, do you think? You and also just any of you guys, Eben, you want to?
Yeah, I might jump in and proliferate the vocabulary and questions, and you know, push against the idea of the commons, and maybe reframe the questions as, you know, how do we live with others that make demands on us, whether those demands are blood, you know, for a mosquito, or you know, our cellular organelles, the coronavirus. You know, and maybe also proliferate worlds to think about multi-species worldings and multi-species justice alongside multi-world justice, so rather than kind of a singular abstract universal world or commons, what shared worlds do we embrace and what do we push away from? What kinds of demands are worth accommodating and what are, necessarily destructive and violent to our own existence. I think Michel Serres is really helpful for thinking about these kind of things, playing with the host-guest ambiguity. But also, how do we proliferate contact zones to invoke Haraway again and have better conflicts in those contact zones? Here I'm thinking with Christina Lyons, also Isabel Stingers, to think not about the possibilities of a final peace that Kant might have imagined, but the ongoingness of life with others who don't share your interests, with others in a multi-species realm that might have their own self-interest in mind, but how do we rethink our self and our self-interests in a multitude and in the context of these thousands of plateaus and intensities and becomings and unbecomings that you describe? So I think an idea of a universal commons might kind of negate the diversities of interests and values that come together in shared worlds. And I see shared worlds as a phenomenological proposition, like what kinds of worlds can we perceive and act upon and embrace others within. But yeah, it's also an ontological proposition to think about, this is a world, a community I belong to and with, I can't escape. But at some moments you do want to escape, whether it's a particular violent individual monkey or a mosquito that might carry a virus or a plasmodium malarial parasite. So yeah, just proliferating the vocabulary and questions.
In the Indian context, we had some recent thinking on this. There's a recent book by Radhika Govindarajan on animal intimacies. And so she takes on the idea of kinship, kin making from Donna Haraway. And sadly, I think most of the example she gives of kinship, of men, humans and animals living together, becoming close in intimacy, are in cultures which are on the or pre-capitalist. So these are non-urban situations. In urban situations, we have thinking around communities which come around animals, which are built around animals, like there are vigilantes now, or people who feed stray dogs, who come in clash with people who don't want people feeding stray dogs. So contested kind of this is place making for intimacy, but also contestation. So there's conflict there, and most of the example, as I said, are from the pre-capitalist, but in urban situations and the urban we know in India, it's expanding. One of the works which I did about a peacock was when the city reached places which were really beyond the river, never visited. Those were fields which were very arable next to River Yamuna, which have been plowed for centuries, and suddenly they became real estate. And how the dogs in India, the villages, the dogs are shared. Nobody owns them, and the dogs form a kinship. Are seen in an urban village in Haapoja, where the ladies go for a walk and they sit together and sing old traditional songs, and the colony dogs follow them and they go back with them. But they never say words of endearment. There is no kind of spoken intimacy, but there is a closeness, which is like mutual, unspoken of, and it can't be stressed or spoken of, since if they claim those dogs, then the conflict will start between humans. So they remain unclaimed. And somebody talked about Terike Haapoja, another anthropologist. She talked about a surgeon or a simple, man who is interested in saving stray dogs from disease and from all kinds of things. So he comes to treat animals, and he does it with his bare hands. He pulls out the maggots, and as soon as it's finished, so this is a marketplace where the dogs are, and they don't belong to anybody, but they're there. And the moment he's finished, like as if, or as if it's magic, you have a towel appearing, hot water appearing, soap appearing from somewhere. So these are the shopkeepers who bring in all these things that they know that this person is helping animals. So their relationship is with this person who helps animals, and they don't relate with animals directly. There's a indifference which is actually helpful. Sometimes proximity is also problematic, like in the example of the peacocks which were attached to certain villages. Villages leave overnight, almost, and then the peacocks have no human habitat where they can pick up the grains, etc. So in this case, the peacock is all alone trying to hunt food, but the dogs which were left, which nobody owned, and nobody claimed them, and nobody took them along with them. So they are left, and they form packs. They form, and they eat they attack the peacocks. So in this case, in the absence of humans, the thing has gone back to wild. And then the urban comes in, new urban, and then the peacock appears as something exotic, and it's kind of cared for, but communally. It's acknowledged, but it's not claimed. It's just let be. And animals tend to flourish in such a situation, even in the case of feral animals like cats. There's a trend in India of trying to adopt or put up for adoption a pack of litters you find somewhere, And so, but I've seen, in a community, in a locality, cats surviving with the unspoken intimacy of many people who don't claim, is this your cat? They don't say anything because there might be, their interest might be jeopardized in the process. So it's a silent kind of community around animals. So this is another kind of indirect way of looking at intimacy, and which is far from what is spoken in the Vedas, where the queen lay down with the horse, which was to be sacrificed. So that's it.
Shall I read the questions while you're chewing on all of this stuff, Terike? Should I read one of the questions from the chat? And then you can decide what and how and where you want to answer, or do you want to pursue some of these lines first? What would you prefer?
Sure. Yeah, first.
Okay, so there was the question I had mentioned from Damin about a positive kind of intimacy between species, and what would that look like in practice? And then Eben and I sort of followed on some of those questions about what happens when there are conflicts of interests and needs, for example. And then Alexander asks, if we talk about communities and very complex interrelationships between different species, from the anthropocentric relationship and influence to brutal exploitation, or the very feeling of equality of all species, how do we not enter into a fully academic or cultural discussion of general interrelationships in the quotations of philosophers. How do we maintain sensibility and empathy for all of these different kinds of relationships and a deep respect? I am talking about a deep feeling, not just about the understanding, not just about understanding the problems and different cultures in relation to all life on Earth. So that's another thing to think about as you're answering whatever you want, however and whatever you want.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for Hemant, also your comment. That's a great example, or those are great examples of like those sort of borderline or like overlapping worlds that we share partly. Maybe I want to answer it briefly because I want to also hear from others. But maybe the question of intimacy, I think the root cause is that we don't know how to do it amongst our own species. We don't know how to do it amongst our friends or family or lovers. We don't know how to be with each other in a consensual way. And so we're constantly deprived of meaningful, intimate relationships overall. Like I'm saying we as in we who live in capitalism. And that's kind of the force that's constantly eroding meaningful bonds and relationships of consensual or I mean, I know consent also is like you can't, it has its limits, and not all relationships necessarily are consensual, and they might be highly meaningful, but we don't know how to negotiate consent. We don't really, you know, all our relationships are based on coercion, like starting from how we think of justice, our justice system, or transactionary, increasingly so. And so this is, I feel like this is the starting from where we then, if we then just start to think of like, okay, how do we build consensual relationships to multi-species in a multi-species world where we don't have any basic, we're sort of, what's the word, when you can't speak the language, you sort of like, we don't have the, we're not trained to do that really. So I think that's kind of the core problem of like, how do we then even move towards consensual relationships. I wrote, I just copy pasted here. I wrote an essay where I tried to tackle this question, or think through this question of consent and different ways people have thought of consent in relationship to, you know, different communication methods, nonviolent communication, or then transformative justice, restorative justice, to different ways of thinking of like science in indigenous cosmologies or indigenous governance, and then how that would affect our relationships with the more than human world. So I think like we have to train, like we have to have a full on training in that, you know, as people. Then the question, I had one other thought that I wanted to just quickly say. Oh yeah, thank you even for the link to Radhika's book, and then also Porkopolis is an amazing ethnographic work by Alex Blanchet, and we're going to start a reading group in Marxist Education Project this spring, where we read Porkopolis, and we read a lot of stuff around it that, you know, tackles with the question of animal work as labor and different issues and reproductive politics and different things that kind of come out of that question. And the book is about industrial hog farming in the US, and it touches on everything from environmental issues to reproduction to migrant work to, you know, unions, workers' rights. And yeah, thank you. It's a really amazing work, and where he's really like making the point that we can't, it's such a complex biopolitical apparatus at play that we have to think, really look at the details. And maybe this also answers a little bit to Alexander, your really great question. And I think this is this kind of like rooted local research that takes into account the specifics of a time and place is very essential. And And in many cases, I guess the problem is that we start from that the original relationship to land and sustenance we're so uprooted from those relations, those basic relations, that it's hard to then build a site-specific, situation-specific like knowledge. That I think, again, if I think of the Sami scholarship that I'm most familiar with, is very much located in a particular land and particular landscape and particular multi-species relationships that can be, there's no idea that this could be universalized easily as something that would take place somewhere else. And I definitely think that is like that is so crucial and somehow so much more advanced than what I'm doing myself. And what I'm doing is really, I'm trying to somehow deconstruct maybe, this this apparatus here, while trying to support the people who I think are doing this really incredible work that is necessary for the future. But I'd really love to hear from you. Yeah.
One of the things you said that struck me was that we don't have the training, or maybe we don't have the cultural sensitivity, or we have not learned how to really pay attention, as Mary Oliver would call it, to how other forms of life exist in the world well enough. There are people in silos who study specific individual species and know a lot about how those individual species live. And there are people who look at ecological webs, but as ordinary people who are not specialists working on a particular species or particular species relationships, what is our dominant form of encounter with different kinds of species? And I would say that it is of multiple types, right? And that those embodied encounters and experiences do shape to some extent, or offer a sort of implicit, invisible, hidden aesthetic paradigms for how we engage and relate to, and maybe even paradigms that we project onto species that we have no relationship to directly at all. But if we can think about those, bring back the idea of zones of contact, and think about what are the actual spaces of encounter in which we could learn practically, experientially, through some kind of embodied encounter, how to pay better or more careful attention. I know in the multi-species literature, there's a beautiful phrase, cultivating the arts of attentiveness, really learning to pay attention to those relational entangled webs and how they work, and trying to understand them somewhat hermeneutically on their own terms, to see where and how we could connect to or fit in with, or get it, how we are entangled with those, maybe unwittingly. Because I think it's important, if we're really trying to think about how could we learn to live better with other beings, and what would count as living better. First and foremost, looking at what we already do and what sort of unexamined implicit assumptions and again, aesthetic sort of paradigms form the sort of background filters that tell us what they are, and help us interpret what we think they are doing in relationship to us, and how could we perhaps not only widen those lenses, but also offer new kinds of lenses for seeing things that are not only filtered through our let's say our immediate self-interest or immediate personal desires. And so I'm just wondering if any of you guys have thought about what would be different practical modes, because I know some of the audience are people who engage other artists or scholars or other practitioners of different sorts, who really do think about, like, okay, so we can think conceptually about this, but what can we actually do differently? With things like factory farms, I think it's easy to think about what we could do differently. There are certain things we can simply not participate in. But when it comes to the invisibilized violence that is driving most extinctions, I think most of that, if we want to bring up Hannah Arendt again, is a case of not thinking what we are doing, and a complete disconnect between the larger causal implications and repercussions of our dominant way of living and being in the world as it impacts other beings, and not just individual beings, but as it impacts entire ecosystems, entire fields of relationality in massive ways that, whether we intend them or not, whether we're aware of them or not, are incredibly violent as well. So perhaps also just becoming more aware of what we're doing and tracing out some of those causal chains that do emerge from what we do and what we say and what we think and what we eat and what we do with our shit and what we, how we deal with our food and where we live and the ways that we live with others. All of those things that are not intended to kill animals on a mass basis the way that factory farms are, but nevertheless result in enormous, enormous vectors of extinction pressures anyway. So thinking about tracing causal lineages, finding and locating ourselves in those, and then thinking about what our real everyday life practices are that are connected and implicated in those lineages. What might be one way to think about how do we decolonize that commons, and two, I think, I don't think a universal single idea of a commons will make any sense, but in different contexts, in different types of zones of contact, we might think about what the specificities of those relationships are, and if I am in a place where, I sure as hell don't want to be bitten by mosquitoes and given malaria or dengue fever or Zika, but at the same time, if we eradicated all mosquitoes, we might be causing massive ecological consequences that would have cascading effects that we're barely able to understand. And so simply, imagining that getting rid of the things that are uncomfortable for us or we don't like isn't really a solution either. So how do we lay and trace out better together as a community of thinkers and scholars and activists and philosophers and artists working from very many different types of research trajectories? How can we bring our ideas together in a way to better investigate real practical suggestions of how to learn to pay attention, to understand what we're doing, how we're living together, and what can we actually do differently that would have positive consequence? And what would count as positive? What would a really good outcome look like? I think that's something everybody's question is all sort of continually asked. I know we're sort of getting over time here, but I want to give everybody a chance to reply, especially Terike, but if there's anybody else who wants to bring anything in. These aren't going to be answered today. Obviously, all of these questions we're going to have to keep chewing on and thinking about for a very long time. But if you want to throw in some thoughts to keep us going on these questions, it would be great.
I'd love to hear from Eben and Hemant.
I've got to bounce soon, but maybe just one final thought is, how to live with our own cages rather than imagine a world without cages. How do we think about the cages that have been constructed for us, whether it's through informatic systems, agro-industrial complexes, the cages that we're implicated in creating that constrain others, whether those are other animals or other humans, but how do we live within our own cages is I think also one of the contemporary dilemmas. And also something you gestured towards, you talked about animal rights versus social justice, and I think there's real intersectional possibilities that are emerging now, and you see this in African-American literary traditions that have a long history. You see this in post-colonial moments, and identifying those intersectional potentialities, but also recognizing that we don't all share the same values, and that values must be necessarily articulated together as you're doing those intersectional coalition building projects. And by necessity, you're excluding some, as you're noticing and recognizing and elevating and building worlds together with some, there's necessarily others that are outside of the purview of your arts of noticing in a given milieu. That's my final thought.
I'll bring in just few examples, a couple of examples. Firstly, in some cultures in India, there's still the notion of that animal was created in the image of God and not man. So you are taking yourself. You're not. It's immediately the man is not the center of the world. And in such a situation, you are in an environment like the tribes which live in jungles or on land. They are as much animal as others are, and they kill animals for their need. So in fact, their footprint is very light, and they're not killing on mass scale, but they kill for the need. And so does the tiger kill for the need. So does the deer chew grass and destroy all the greenery, undergrowth, and kill mosquitoes or insects. So violence is kind of inevitable, but you become part of that as an animal rather than as a human. So breaking down the distinction. And the other thing I want to talk about is what Heben said about becoming aware of our own cages. And I think in India, certain people have been freed from the cages via the camera. And photography has a history in India, and cameras are very much a new phenomena. Camera in everybody's hand. Earlier we had studios we went to, and then slowly after liberalization in the 1990s, a personal camera became a dream come true. So this is a new thing. People have cameras and they are exploring their immediate environment. And many of them have become birders. And I think just by looking, just by engaging with them visually, just by engaging with their life cycles, there's an awareness which has come, which actually became very prominent in a case where a land was supposed to be cleared for some kind of development, and then the birders came in saying that that land is rich in so and so birds, that they saw a rare bird there, and there was resistance from totally a new constituency.
Wow,
and
that's great.
And so
Yeah.
this is one thing I can think of. The third thing I forgot. So
no worries. Wonderful. I'm sorry that we have to actually wrap it up. We're already 15 minutes over. But Terike, if you have any last thoughts you want to share, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And I know we need to keep having these conversations, but you've provoked a lot of thoughts. If any last thoughts you want to share, go for it. And then I will close the video after that. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you so much for great questions, and Hemant and Eben also and Maya, you for really inspiring contributions to this conversation. And no, I just the same. If someone wants the text of the talk, I'm happy to send it, or any links to videos or anything, or links to the reading group we're going to start next spring on animal capitalism, and really try to think of these overlaps that Eben also mentioned, where we could start working on multi-species class consciousness and build a struggle against capitalism. That's kind of what I'm working on. So if you want to be part of that, very welcome. Yeah, and happy end of the year. Hopefully things will calm down and we can get to work more next year.
That's wonderful. So everybody, I really appreciate everyone coming so close to the end of the year, especially Terike, for taking time out from your family holiday to bring your work and your ideas to us and to our little community here and across the world that we're slowly building. It's so important to have these kinds of different voices and conversations shared. This is the beginning, not the end of the conversation, and we would love to post those links when we upload the YouTube video from the talk. So we'll get all those links and put them there, as well as on our Omramundi multi-species ecological world making lab page on Facebook as well. And we're having a website coming in the new year. So all of those links will be available, and that's a way we can keep the conversation going. And in another month, we will be having Heather Davis talking about plastic, and I'm looking very much forward to that. So hope everyone has a fabulous new year. Stay safe from Omicron and take good care of each other and your multi-species kin as best you can. Thanks everyone. Thank you, Arya, for running this today. And Hemant, thank you also. Eben had to leave. We were supposed to be done 15 minutes ago. So thanks to everybody who came, and Terike, have a great evening with your family. Thanks a lot for making time for us. We appreciate it so much. Everyone take care. Okay. Thank you for the great questions. Bye.
Bye.